You cleaned the house. You prepared yourself mentally. You smiled at the door. You were present, engaged, warm. You laughed at the right moments. You asked the right questions. You held the conversation like you were supposed to. And then they left. And the moment that door closed behind them, something in you collapsed. Not dramatically, not with tears or a breakdown or any visible sign of distress, just a quiet full-body deflation. Like a balloon that had been held at a certain pressure for hours and finally got to release. You sat down, or maybe you didn't even make it to the couch. Maybe you just stood there in the hallway for a moment, and you felt it. That specific bone-deep exhaustion that has nothing to do with how long they stayed or how much you actually did. The kind of tired that comes not from physical exertion but from something much harder to name. And here is the part that nobody talks about. The part that lives underneath the exhaustion. The part that makes it complicated in a way that simple tiredness never is. You might have actually enjoyed their company. You might have genuinely liked the people who just left. You might have laughed sincerely and felt real warmth and been truly, authentically glad to see them. And still, the moment they were gone, the relief was enormous. Immediate, almost guilty in its intensity. Why does that happen? Why does the presence of other people, even people you love, even people you chose to invite into your space, cost you so much? Why does socializing leave certain people feeling like they have run a marathon they didn't sign up for? Carl Jung had an answer, and it is one of the most important, most clarifying, most personally liberating pieces of psychological insight ever offered to the human race. And today on Mind Vision, we are going all the way into it. Let's start at the beginning, with Jung himself and with the framework that changed everything. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who spent decades studying the architecture of the human psyche. He was a student of Freud, then a departure from Freud, then something entirely his own, a thinker whose ideas were so far ahead of their time that we are still catching up to them nearly a century later. And one of his most enduring, most practically useful contributions to psychology was a concept that most people think they understand, but almost nobody fully appreciates in its depth: the concept of introversion. Now, before you nod and say, yes, I know I am an introvert, stay with me, because what Jung meant by introversion is significantly richer, significantly more nuanced, and significantly more interesting than the modern shorthand of shy person who likes to be alone. Jung was not talking about a social preference. He was talking about a fundamental orientation of the psyche, a deep structural difference in how certain people relate to energy, to reality, to the world itself. Jung observed that human beings differ in a foundational way in terms of where their psychological energy, what he called libido, not in the Freudian sexual sense, but in the broader sense of psychic life force, where that energy naturally flows. For some people, it flows outward, toward the external world, toward people, activity, stimulation, engagement. These are the extroverts. The world recharges them. Contact with others fills them up. Solitude for extended periods drains them. But for others, and Jung counted himself among them, the energy flows inward, toward the interior world, toward thought, reflection, imagination, the rich and endlessly complex landscape of the inner life. These are the introverts, and for them, the external world, no matter how interesting, no matter how beloved the people in it, is fundamentally a place that costs energy rather than generates it. This is not a character flaw. This is not social anxiety dressed up in philosophical language. This is not shyness or misanthropy or an inability to connect. It is a genuine, neurologically supported difference in how the psyche processes stimulation and allocates its resources. And when Jung says this is why visitors exhaust you, he is pointing at something so specific, so precise, so perfectly targeted at what you actually experience that hearing it for the first time feels less like learning something new and more like finally having a language for something you have always known. Let me explain the mechanism, because the mechanism is everything. When an introvert engages with the external world, and social interaction is one of the most demanding forms of external engagement possible, they are drawing on a finite reserve of psychic energy. Not infinite, not renewable in real time, finite, like a battery that discharges during use and must be recharged through specific conditions. And for the introvert, those specific recharging conditions almost always involve withdrawal from external stimulation, solitude, quiet, the interior world. What this means in practice is that every conversation, no matter how enjoyable, every social obligation, every visitor who arrives and fills your space with their energy and their needs and their presence, every single one of these draws from that reserve. And the more complex the social situation, the more energy it costs. The more people involved, the higher the drain. The more performance required, the smiling, the small talk, the social navigation, the reading of the room, the faster the battery depletes. And here is the part that makes this so particularly interesting for people who have never had it explained this way before. The drain is not proportional to how much you like the person. This is the piece that confuses introverts most. They think something must be wrong with them because they are exhausted by people they genuinely love. They feel guilty because the relief they feel when visitors leave seems to suggest they didn't want them there. They interpret their own exhaustion as evidence of some deficiency in their capacity for connection or warmth or love. Jung would say, categorically, unambiguously, that interpretation is wrong. The exhaustion has nothing to do with how you feel about the person. It has everything to do with the fundamental orientation of your psyche and the energy cost of sustained external engagement. You can love someone completely and still find their prolonged presence depleting. Those two things are not in contradiction. They are simply the reality of being someone whose psyche is oriented inward in a world that consistently, relentlessly, almost aggressively rewards outward orientation. But here is where Jung goes even deeper. Here is where his framework becomes not just explanatory but genuinely transformative. Because Jung didn't just describe introversion as a characteristic, he described it as a gift. A specific, profound, irreplaceable gift that the world desperately needs and chronically undervalues. The introvert's orientation toward the interior world, the very thing that makes visitors exhausting, is also the thing that makes them extraordinarily capable of depth, of genuine reflection, of the kind of sustained, patient, deeply honest inner work that produces real wisdom rather than just accumulated information. Introverts, Jung argued, are the natural contemplatives, the natural depth seekers, the people who are constitutionally equipped to go beneath the surface of things and find what actually lives there. The same psyche that needs to recover after visitors also produces the richest inner life. The same sensitivity that makes social stimulation costly also makes solitary experience extraordinarily vivid and rewarding. The same inward orientation that the world sometimes reads as antisocial or cold or difficult is actually the source of some of the most profound contributions to human thought, art, psychology, and philosophy ever made. Jung himself was deeply introverted. He spent long periods in solitude, famously retreating to his tower at Bollingen, a simple stone structure with no electricity, no running water, just Jung and his inner world, and the kind of quiet that modern life makes almost impossible to find. And it was in that solitude, in that deliberate withdrawal from the external world, that some of his most important thinking happened. He wasn't hiding. He was working, in the only way his psyche knew how to work at its deepest level. And here is what I want you to sit with as we move toward part 2, because we are only halfway through this, and the second half is where it gets even more personal, even more specific, even more directly applicable to the life you are actually living. If visitors exhaust you, if social obligations feel like a weight you carry rather than a pleasure you anticipate, if the moment you are finally alone again, your whole body sighs with something that feels uncomfortably close to joy, Jung is not telling you that something is wrong with you. He is telling you something is deeply, specifically, profoundly right. So we left off at something being right. That specific, quietly revolutionary idea that the very thing you have spent years apologizing for, the exhaustion, the relief, the guilty pleasure of a closed door and an empty room, is not a deficiency, not a social failure, not evidence of something broken inside you that needs to be fixed before you can be considered a fully functioning, properly connected human being. It is, according to one of the greatest minds in the history of psychology, evidence of a particular kind of psyche, a particular kind of orientation, a particular kind of inner architecture that is as valid, as valuable, and is genuinely necessary to the world as its opposite. But knowing that intellectually and actually living it, actually giving yourself permission to honor your own nature in a world that was not designed for it, those are two very different things. And that gap, that distance between understanding and permission, is where most introverts spend the majority of their lives. Stuck, knowing what they are, but not quite believing they are allowed to be it without consequence. So let's talk about the consequence. Let's talk about what actually happens, psychologically, physically, relationally, when an introvert consistently ignores their own nature and tries to function as though they are something else. Jung had a concept for this. He called it the persona, the mask we construct for the external world. The version of ourselves that we present in social situations, in professional contexts, in any environment where we feel that our authentic self would not be fully accepted or understood. Everyone has a persona. It is not inherently pathological. It is simply the natural human adaptation to the fact that we exist in social contexts that have their own expectations and norms. But here is where it becomes a problem, specifically for introverts in an extrovert-favoring world. When the gap between the persona and the authentic self becomes too wide, when the mask is worn for too long without removal, when the performance of extroversion becomes so constant and so complete that the introvert barely remembers who they are underneath it, the psyche begins to protest. And it protests in ways that are impossible to ignore once you know what you are looking at. Chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to fix. A persistent, low-grade irritability that surfaces most intensely in social situations and immediately after them. A growing sense of disconnection, not from other people but from yourself. The feeling of going through motions. The feeling of watching your own life from a slight distance, as though you are a participant and an observer simultaneously, and neither role feels quite real. A creeping, nameless dissatisfaction that you cannot source because on paper everything is fine. You have the relationships, the social life, the appearance of connection, and yet something fundamental feels absent. That absence is you, the interior you, the self that only exists in solitude and silence and the deep, uninterrupted inner world that you have been too busy performing extroversion to visit. Jung called this kind of disconnection from the authentic self neurosis. Not in the dramatic, clinical sense the word sometimes carries today, but in the precise Jungian sense of a psyche in conflict with itself. A person living against their own grain for so long that the friction has become a permanent condition rather than a temporary discomfort. And here is the thing about that friction. It doesn't just affect you internally, it affects every relationship you have. Because when you are chronically depleted, when you are running on psychic empty, when every social interaction feels like a withdrawal from an account that never gets replenished, you cannot be genuinely present for the people in your life. You can perform presence, you can go through the motions of connection. But the real thing, the deep, warm, fully attentive, genuinely available quality of presence that makes human connection actually meaningful, that requires energy you don't have because you never allowed yourself to refill it. Paradoxically, and this is one of the most important paradoxes in all of Jungian psychology, the introvert who honors their need for solitude is actually more capable of genuine connection than the introvert who ignores it. Because they show up full, they show up present, they show up with something real to give rather than a performance of giving that costs them everything and satisfies nobody. The solitude is not the enemy of connection. The solitude is what makes genuine connection possible. Now, I want to talk about something Jung explored that goes even deeper than introversion itself. Something that explains not just why visitors exhaust you, but why certain visitors exhaust you more than others. Why some social situations drain you completely, while others, rarer, more specific, more carefully chosen, actually leave you feeling strangely energized rather than depleted. Jung talked about the difference between shallow connection and what he might describe as soul-level encounter. The kind of conversation that goes somewhere real. The kind of exchange where two people actually meet, not their personas, not their social performances, but something genuine and unguarded and true. The kind of interaction where you leave knowing something you didn't know before, about the other person, about the world, about yourself. For the introvert, that kind of encounter is not draining. It is nourishing. because it engages the interior world rather than bypassing it, because it requires depth rather than performance, because it allows the introvert to bring their actual self to the exchange rather than the carefully constructed social version that costs so much to maintain. What exhausts the introvert is not people. It is the performance that most social situations demand: the small talk, the surface navigation, the management of impressions and expectations, and the endless, energy-consuming work of being what the room needs rather than what you actually are. Strip away the performance. Give the introvert a conversation that goes deep, a connection that feels real, a space where authenticity is not just permitted but required, and suddenly the equation changes entirely. Suddenly, the person who seemed to find all human contact draining reveals themselves as someone capable of extraordinary intimacy, extraordinary depth, extraordinary presence. Not despite their introversion, because of it. This is what Jung wanted introverts to understand about themselves: that their orientation is not a limitation on their capacity for connection. It is a specification of the kind of connection they are built for. Deep over wide, real over performed, meaningful over merely social. And once an introvert truly internalizes that, once they stop trying to be everything to everyone and start being completely, authentically themselves for the specific few who are capable of meeting them there, something shifts, something settles. Something that has been tense and effortful and quietly exhausting for years begins, slowly and then all at once, to relax. Now, there is one more thing Jung said that I need to bring into this conversation. One more piece of this framework that is so directly applicable to the experience of being exhausted by visitors that it would be almost negligent to leave it out. Jung believed that the path to psychological wholeness, what he called individuation, required not the suppression of your natural orientation, but the deepening of it. He did not tell introverts to push through, to practice being more social, to gradually expand their tolerance for external stimulation until they approximated extroversion. He said the opposite. He said, go deeper into what you are, understand it more completely, honor it more fully, because it is in the full, unashamed inhabitation of your authentic nature that the self becomes whole, not in the endless, exhausting attempt to be something you are not. What this means practically, what it looks like in the actual lived texture of a daily life, is permission. Real, unconditional, psychologically grounded permission to structure your life around your own nature rather than against it. To say no to social obligations that cost more than they give without explaining or justifying that no to anyone. To protect your solitude with the same seriousness that other people protect their social calendars. To recognize that your closed door, your quiet evening, your deliberate withdrawal from the world is not antisocial behavior, it is psychological maintenance. It is the necessary non-negotiable work of keeping yourself whole. And to stop, finally, completely stop, apologizing for needing it. Now here is the cinematic moment. Here is where everything lands. Picture the scene, your home, after everyone has left. The particular quality of silence that only exists in a space that was recently full of people and is now fully, completely yours again. The slight disorder of recent company, a cup left on the table, cushions rearranged, the ghost of conversation still faintly present in the air. And you, standing in the middle of it, or sitting, or lying flat on the floor, because sometimes that is exactly what the body needs, and there is nobody left to perform okayness for. And instead of feeling guilty about the relief, instead of analyzing it, pathologizing it, turning it into evidence of something wrong with you simply feel it, fully, without apology, without the running commentary of self-judgment that usually accompanies it. You let the quiet in, all the way in. You feel your nervous system begin its slow, grateful descent from the heightened state that social engagement requires back to the baseline that is your natural home. You feel the tension in your shoulders release. You feel your breathing deepen. You feel the interior world, that vast, rich, endlessly interesting landscape inside you that gets drowned out by external noise. You feel it begin to surface again, gently, like something that has been waiting patiently for the room to clear. And in that moment, in that specific, quiet, completely ordinary moment that nobody else would recognize as significant, you are doing something profoundly important. You are coming home to yourself, not away from the people you love, Not in rejection of connection or warmth or the genuine pleasure of human company at its best, but home, to the source, to the place where you are most real, most whole, most completely and authentically yourself. Jung spent a lifetime trying to help people find that place. He called it the self, the deep, authentic, fully integrated core of the personality that exists beneath all the personas and adaptations and performances we construct for the world. And he believed, with complete conviction, backed by decades of clinical work and personal experience, that the path to that self ran directly through the interior world, through reflection, through solitude, through the deliberate, courageous, countercultural choice to turn inward in a world that never stops insisting you turn out. The visitors exhausted you because you are built for depth, because your psyche invests fully in every human encounter and needs time to reclaim what it gave. Because you are not a surface-level person living in a surface-level way, and the cost of genuine presence, the kind of presence you offer, the kind that actually sees people and actually listens and actually cares, is real and significant and worth honoring. You are not broken. You are not antisocial. You are not cold or difficult or too much or not enough. You are an introvert in the most Jungian sense of the word, a person whose greatest gifts live on the inside, a person who needs silence the way others need sunlight, a person who gives their best, their most genuine, most profound, most truly human best, not when they are performing for the world, but when they are fully, quietly, unapologetically themselves. Close the door. Turn off the noise. Let the quiet do what only the quiet can do. And remember what Jung knew, what he lived and proved and gave his life's work to understanding. The interior world is not where you hide from life. It is where you find it. This has been Mind Vision. If this episode felt like something you have been waiting to hear, share it with someone who needs the permission. Subscribe because every episode we go deeper, and today was just the beginning. And remember, your solitude is not your weakness. It is where your greatness lives. See you next time.